Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Suchandra Ghosh, Professor, Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. The subject today is Indian culture and the paper is Indian polity. I shall be discussing with you the module Taxation System in North India till 600 CE. The learning objective of this module is to understand the system of revenue collection in ancient India. What was the system, how the kings used to collect their revenues. Then secondly, to get the students acquainted with the various kinds of taxes that are known from our sources, both literature and epigraphy. Now when we look at the revenue collection system, we find that if you have a state, then revenue system is the backbone of that state. Unless and until you have a proper taxation system, state cannot be formed, because your exchequer is very important to pay for your army, to pay for other expenses. Therefore, the treasury was considered as one of the seven elements of the state in Kautilya's Arthashastra, that is in the Sapta Prakriti. And its importance was sometimes held even greater than the army. Army needed to be paid with the revenues that were realized by the state. In the Ramayana and even in the Mahabharata, but first we will talk about the Ramayana, we find that Dasharatha advises Rama to replenish treasury and granary. These are the two terms, one is Kosha, the other is Koshtagara. Those were very important for a state. Even the Mahabharata lays down that the treasury must be replenished by taking wealth from the people, and when filled, it should be carefully kept and sought to be increased, which means that your treasury should be always full, and you should be prosperous only when you have the ability to increase the amount of wealth in your treasury. The importance of a healthy treasury is also fully recognized by the Buddhist literature. Thus, Brahmanical treatises, Epico-Puranic literature, Buddhist literature all talks about the importance of a healthy treasury. Now the question remains that how do you maintain a healthy treasury? How can you improve the condition of your treasury? And herein comes the topic of our discussion, that is taxation. We can do that only through taxation. Now what are the sources? How do we know about it? We all know that ancient Indian studies is limited by our sources. Here we have both textual and epigraphic sources which give us information about the revenue terms. Arthashastra is the most important text in this regard, and it talks about different forms of payments to the state treasury. We of course have reference to some of the tax names in the Vedas, but at that time those taxes were not yet crystallized. So they were in a very nebulous form. We have the words, but the exact meaning of the words were not clearly understood in the Vedas, and we will come to that later on. The other Dharma Shastras also provide us information about the prevalence of different kinds of taxes. Now when we have tax, we have the names of the taxes, but then before that it is important that we also know the principles of taxation. A ruler cannot go on taxing people indiscriminately. So there were certain principles, and just as in the later context we have Adam Smith, the famous financial expert, economist, who we know about his principles. Similarly, in ancient India, when we look at the different kinds of taxes, we have similar kinds of principles. And therefore, the state's power of taxation, though it is unlimited and unrestricted, certain doctrines or principles are kept in view for the optimum economic welfare of the people. Adam Smith's famous doctrines of certainty, convenience and economy were fairly applicable to the system of taxation in ancient India. The Arthashastra lays down that the taxes on all merchandise intended for sale were required to be seen and it was to be accessed for all. There is a quote, "Whosoever doubles the revenue eats into the vitality of the country and will deserve punishment." So therefore, we see that too much of taxation was also not allowed in the Arthashastra. Next, we have our prescriptive, the normative texts, and the Shastric persons like the Vasishtha and Manu suggest that the ruler, though reduced to poverty, should not take anything that ought not to be taken. That means there were certain things the ruler should not take, nor should he refuse to take that which he ought to take in spite of being wealthy. So there are certain rules that you can take some things from your subjects, you cannot take something from your subjects. And these principles may indicate the prescription of taxes and thus satisfy the canon of certainty, which was illustrated by later on by Adam Smith. So you know that certain taxes are certain and you are supposed to take that even if your treasury is full of wealth. This was the normal course. Adam Smith's doctrine of convenience is also well illustrated in a large number of metaphors. For example, we have in the text, like as the leech, the bees, they take their food little by little, so the king should draw from his subjects a reasonable annual taxes. So he cannot go beyond certain limit. Then we have also reference to the king that he should impose taxes gradually and with mildness in proper season. The term used is yatha kalam and according to the due form, yatha vidhi. Now yatha kalam and yatha vidhi actually are the customs and usages. It shows that when you are supposed to, suppose there is a drought in the country, then the peasants are suffering, there is no production, no produce. So naturally your king is not supposed to take tax at that point of time. So these are the prescriptions. Now whether the king will take or not, that will depend on the nature of the king. So it is yatha kalam and according to due yatha vidhi, that is the due norms. You cannot go beyond the norms. Secondly, the principle of economy implies the minimum possible costs of collections. So you cannot go out of a way to collect taxes. The Arthashastra prescribes that works of revenue should be conducted in such a way that it tends to increase the revenue of the state and decrease the expenditure, which means if a lot of people are to be employed to collect taxes, this is not good for the state because these people will have to be paid, and if so many people have to be paid, so naturally there is a burning in the exchequer. From this we can move to another topic, fiscal productiveness, that how fiscal revenue can be enriched and how you can generate revenue. It consists in the fact that tax proceeds should sufficiently cover the government expenditure and deficit be avoided, but it should not cripple the economic resources of the country, which means that whatever expenditure the government is going to incur, that should come from the taxes. That should be the main motto of the ruler. For example, the Junagadh rock inscription of Rudradaman is very important in this case. It clearly says that while actually repairing the Sudarshana dam of the Sudarshana lake, the ruler did not impose any vishti, kara or pranaya on the people, and he had actually taken those taxes which he is supposed to take. So even if you have your treasury, and it is said that his treasury was full, So even if you have your treasury full of wealth, the ruler will take taxes from the people, which is according to norms. Kautilya says that the quality of a good country lies in the capability of supporting the expenditure. So there should not be deficit expenditure. Whatever expenditure is there, the king and his associates should actually know how to support the expenditure. Again, the taxes should be imposed in such a way that the state as well as the people engaged in production of the articles could both partake of the output. For example, the crops. If you have huge quantity of crops grown, then naturally after the paying the state 1/6 of the produce, then the peasants will also enjoy the produce. So this is actually very important, and the principles of elasticity and diversity were also recognized, that when necessary you can impose a little more tax, you can have diverse kind of taxes, but generally one has to follow the norms. The former enables the increase in its financial resources in a state of emergency, and we have number of emergency taxes mentioned in our literature. For example, pranaya. Pranaya is said to be an extra tax or an emergency tax when you need some extra money. This has always been given or mentioned in our literature, particularly the Dharma Shastras. Now we have to see that what are the modes of taxation. We have learnt about taxation, the principles of taxation, how the fiscal produce were being productivity, and now we will go into the modes. How revenue was collected, whether it was in cash or whether it was in kind. We find that revenues were collected both in cash and also in kind. But we have more examples of revenues being collected in kind, and the tax names also support this. The classical writers refer to the share of the state in the form of the produce of the soil, which was obviously in kind. So crops were being given, so produce of that is the produce of the soil. When we look at Ashoka's Luminde inscription, where Lumini was the place where Buddha was born, we find that the term Autobhagya, and Ashoka has been taken, and it has been taken to mean 1/8 of the land produce, which denotes the practice of collection in kind. So here Ashoka actually reduced the tax amount for the subjects because this was the region where Buddha was born. The Arthashastra talks about different forms of payment to the state treasury. They were in cash or in grains, cattle, raw materials, and also by corvée, that is vishti, which I will explain later on. A fine of 53 panas could be imposed for an unauthorized taking away of corn from fields, and this suggests that revenue was realized in kind. We have reference to Sharabhaga, that is 1/6 of the part of the revenue, which was always given in kind. So as I mentioned in the earlier, that tax in kind was much more talked about, written about in the Shastric literature. So we find that the Smritis refer to the revenues in grains from cultivated lands. Even in the Mahabharata, the king is enjoined to make his treasury rich with corn. Apart from this, some of the shipping duties also paid by merchants who were coming from far were probably also in kind. This will not be the corn or the grains of the land, because these merchants were coming from far away places, but they were giving something else, not cash, to the rulers. And this is, we have a very good example about this. If we look at the Begram treasury, which Begram is a place in Afghanistan, and there a whole lot of things were found in a room which is said to be a toll house. Now scholars believe that the things that were been found like vases, beautiful glasses and other things were actually tolls or taxes that the merchants were paying in kind. So you have different kinds of kinds. For like grains were also things which you give in kind, and potteries, glasses, vases, these are also things that are also given in kind. We have very interestingly a name of an officer called Dronomapaka, and therefore he probably measured and collected the corn by drona measure. We have, and let me explain to you, we have different measuring units from the literature. So one is known as Vapa or Kulya Vapa, which is also a measuring unit, and drona is a measuring unit. So when Vapa means the amount of seed that can hold a kulya, that is, kulya is a form of a plate or something like that. So therefore what we find is that this Dronavapaka becomes very important as an evidence to show that you have officers who can measure your crops in drona measurement. There are a lot of more other examples of tax in kind, and here we may refer to the Jatakas. We are told in the Jatakas that at the time of famine, the villagers approached the headman for help, saying, 2 months from now, when we have harvested the grain, we will pay you in kind, which shows perhaps at that point of time there was some crisis, and therefore the villagers said that they will pay the tax in kind after 2 months. The Jatakas also frequently inform us of the villages yielding 100,000. But they also show that the revenue was realized in grains. In one of the Jatakas, we have this term Boli and Kahapana separately mentioned. The records of the Pallavas, if we go further south, though we are talking about North India, I have used this example to show that specifically they mention the contributions to state officials which were in kind. Now from kind we will move to cash, and cash was possible because there was monetization in this period. So from 600 BCE to 600 CE, right from the time of the Janapadas, we have monetization. We have Panchmark coins, then cast copper coins, different kinds of coins. So there was a monetary system active in our country during that period. Therefore, we have copious data on the revenues that were paid in cash. The Arthashastra fully testifies to cash payments to the treasury. It refers to shulka, which is toll, which was likely paid in money and not in kind, for the same time levied on the total value of the commodity, which means if there is a transaction on a particular commodities, then taxes had to be paid for that transaction. And in later period, we had terms like shulpka, mondopika, where actually cess was taken, shulka was taken from that market center, which is the mondopika is a middle category market center. Again, if we go to the post-Mauryan times, we have Hathigumpha inscription of Kharavela from the early 1st century BCE, which records that the king remitted taxes and duties amounting to many 100,000 coins. Kahapanas, Kashapana was the term generally used in the Jatakas, which shows that there was strong monetization and currency system during this time. Money endowments are also another example from which we can understand that there were movement of cash. Large number of inscriptions of North, West and South India, particularly the Buddhist caves, they had the inscriptions, or the Buddhist monastic sites like Shanchi, Bharut, cave sites in Western Deccan like Karle, Bhaja, Kanheri, Junnar. All these sites had donative records by the merchants, the laymen, upasakas and many other people following other professions. And there they mention that they are donating in cash. So with kind, cash was also equally applicable. We have this interesting term called Sir Dea Mea occurring in the Kale Buddhist cave inscription of the time of King Pulumavi of the Satavahana dynasty, and it has been described or explained by UN Ghoshal, who has written very important book on taxation, as with the taxes in kind and in cash imposed upon agricultural land, which means Sir Dea Mea, that with Dea Mea is the taxes in kind and cash imposed upon agricultural land. Another fiscal term, Hiranya, also frequently occurs in our sources, which points out to a tax in money. So these are examples of taxes paid in cash. Hiranya normally means gold, but here an ordinary people will not pay in gold. So it is the cash which is implied by the term Hiranya. So from this, when we look at the kind of taxes which is given in kind and are given in cash, we can conclude that the contributions in cash and in kind were levied side by side in all parts of ancient India, and this process was evidently convenient for the people. Now let us have a look at the revenue terms. What are the terms? What terms do they talk about in the inscriptions or the text? This we have to find out. The most common term was bhaga. Bhaga means share. Share from whom or from which part? This is a share of the crop, because agriculture is the mainstay of our economy. So it is always, when we talk of share, it is land related. In the former case, the term sharbhago, that in case of bhagas, the term we have sharbhaga, sharbhagam or sharbhagin, which referred to in the early Dharma Sutras, the Arthashastra, the Epic and the Sritis, was used to denote the legitimate and regular share of the king in kind, that is 1/6 of the produce. So this continued as a legal share. This was the normal legal share of the gross produce that could be claimed by the king and was generally approved by the authorities. So the king, without any hesitation and according to due norm, could always claim 1/6 of the produce of the crop of the peasants or his subjects. But apart from that, this was though regular, it was not the only share. We have Gautama Dharma Sutra, who probably belonged to the pre-Mauryan period, and it prescribed 3 distinct rates: 1/6, 1/8, 1/10. The commentators also talk about different kinds of rates to apply to different types of land. So we have Haradatta's writings also. So what happens is that the tax is decided by the quality of the land. If the land is of high quality, then a kind of, the yield will be more and then the tax will be more. So the quality of the land decides on the nature of the tax. But generally remember that the common regular fixation was 1/6 of the produce. Now we are moving to another very interesting tax name, that is called Boli. Now Boli has changed its connotation from its earliest reference in the Vedas, Rig Veda, to later portions. In the Rig Veda, Boli was a voluntary gift to the king or to the chief, the Rajan. The nature of the Boli changed in the later Vedic period gradually from a voluntary tribute to a regular tax. We find that in the text that the king is called Boli Rit, Boli Haran, Boli Rit, which means one who takes Boli from you. So it is no more a voluntary tax, it is now an imposed tax. In the period of the Brahmanas, Bali seems to have been known as a compulsory contribution payable by the subjects, just as I just mentioned that it became an imposed tax and the ruler was known as Bali Rit. It was basically a land tax. In the post-Mauryan period, there was a regular and legal tax like Bhaga, Shulka, and with that we have the term Boli. And here also we are talking about Rudradaman's inscription, where it is said that he had taken according to norm, Boli, Bhago and Shulka. But on the other hand, we have a completely different kind of meaning for Boli in the text called Milinda Pahyo. Milinda Pahyo, which is a text which is Milinda's question, and which is a text of the 1st century BC, and which talks about King Menander's encounter with the Buddhist monk Nagasena. There we have reference to Boli as an emergency text. However, it is better to take Boli as not as an emergency text, but an text which was used with Bhaga and Shulka. The third very important kind of tax that was enumerated in our literature and of course in our inscriptions was Karo, whose meaning differed from text to text. It is actually very difficult to give a definite definition of Kara. With the passage of time, Kara came to be used differently in different texts. As a fiscal term, it appears to have been unknown to the earlier literature, but in the Arthashastra and the law books, it is of frequent occurrence. Thus, if we look at the Vedic corpus, we don't find the term Kara. Epigraphic sources in particular indicate that Kara was a general tax. In the land grants, we have terms like O Kara Dai or O Kara Dai which denotes one who is exempt from tax in general. Therefore, we can understand that there were tax exemptions. We will talk about it later. Some of the records also like we have expressions like Sarva Kara Pariharai or Sarva Kara Sameta, which simply implies that Kara comprised of all taxes. Sarva Kara Sameta with all the kinds of taxes. So there is the difference again from Kara as just a tax and with all kinds of taxes. Then we have a tax called Vishti. Now Vishti is a kind of tax which is forced labor. That is, if there is a welfare activity, people were asked to come and work for the king. So they are supposed to render their labor to the state without getting anything in return. And that Vishti was very much in practice, is again known from Rudradaman's inscription, because he categorically says that when he had this welfare activity, the repairment of the Sudarshan lake, he did not impose Vishti on the people. Vishti was generally imposed, as I mentioned, for public utility or again for warfare. Kautilya mentions that the state officials were required to maintain a proper account of Vishti contributed by each household. And we find that in the Gupta period, you have numerous references to Vishti. So therefore, though otherwise one may talk about the Gupta period as a very pleasant period, Vishtis were very much there in this during the time of the Guptas. Earlier we mentioned about taxes in cash, and we also talked about Hiranya. Here we will learn a little more about what is Hiranya. And this is a tax name which frequently occurs in literary sources and inscriptions. It implied cash payment, of course. Hiranya literally means gold, but technically it means king's share in certain crops, which was paid in cash rather than in kind as bhoga. Bhoga is also another kind of tax which was periodic in nature. For example, there is something in the palace and people would go and give king some tributes, maybe some fruits, maybe some vegetables. So these fell under the category of bhoga. So there was no certainty or certain measurement for bhoga, which was a periodical tax. Since taxes on certain types of products were paid in cash, we may expect that Hiranya and that sometimes were levied on commercial crops, because we have examples that crops were also used for commercial uses from our inscriptions. Now you had an understanding of the different kinds of revenue terms. Now with the help of two case studies, we can see or understand how these revenue terms or revenues were collected by the ruling powers, for example the Mauryas and the Guptas. To begin with the Mauryas, we find that for the maintenance of the large army and for the expenditure of the people that were working under the Mauryan rule, they required a large amount of money, and therefore these revenues terms were found and they were imposing to people the bhaga, bhoga, kara, hiranya and all kinds of things are there. We have a particular cess called udaka bhaga, that is an irrigation cess that we have found. Megasthenes gives us a lot of information on the Mauryan period also. So we understand that there was lot of revenue generation in the Mauryan period, otherwise it would have not been possible to maintain such a vast army and also to do all the expenditure of the state. Revenue were collected from the agrarian sector, that is well known, but in the Mauryan period revenue was also collected from the non-agrarian sector, and among the non-agrarian sector mining was very important. Therefore, we find that Arthashastra talks about khani, that is mines, and even in the inscriptions of Ashoka we find that mining becomes a prerogative for the ruler, and therefore we have in the Suvarnagari district an Aryaputra who would look after the mining operations. There are references to financial stringencies also in our text, and therefore it is said that when extremely harsh measures could be taken to replenish the treasury during an emergency. So pranaya kriya. So whenever you have emergency, there were examples where we could take harsh measures. I was talking about irrigation cess in the Mauryan period, that is known as udaka bhaga. The sources for post-Mauryan and Gupta periods do not point to anything like irrigation tax. But we are not to think that irrigation tax might be is not there because the rulers were not interested in doing irrigation process, but it was generally done by the private landholders. Manu says that selling one own garden or a tank would be a sin. So saving irrigation projects was looked upon as a kind of a merit. Now let us move to the Gupta period, and in this period we find that agriculture was also the basis of economy, and so therefore was an important source of revenue. The principal tax as usual was bhaga, but we have some new tax called uparikara or udranga, which denoted a tax on the permanent subjects. Then we have some other terms like halikakara, ditya, meya, tulya meya and dhanya. So these other revenue terms that we find in the Gupta period also, for example, in dhanya is found in Western India, halikakara in Central India. Then we have the word ditya, which occurs in the Surat plates of Tirikutaka king Vigrashana, which means that which is to be given. So it is to be given, the tax. The expression sarva ditya vishti pariharana, meaning exemption from all dues and forced labor, sarva ditya vishti. So the commercial sector also yielded tolls and customs or shulkas. As I mentioned, shulka mandapika, shulka, and we also had in officers known as sholkika who were in charge of the collection of shulka figures in several inscriptions. Epigraphic material strongly suggests that agricultural taxes were numerically superior to those of crafts and industries. For example, we have also the charters of the Parivrajakas, the Uchakalpas, the Vakatakas who were ruling in Western India and in Central India, and there we find some important revenue terms such as Udranga, Uparika, Bhoga Bhaga, Kara, Hiranya, Dhanya, then Klipta, Upaklipta. These are some of the new terms that came into use in these regions. And when we look at that, when we finish the Gupta period and we come to the early medieval period, we find that these tax names continued in this period, and there were certain new taxes also. But what is interesting to note is that their oppression had also started, and therefore we find the term pira. And in some cases, when they talk of the taxes, bhoga, bhaga, kara, hiranya, adi. So there is this adi, which means some extra tax which could be taken. So therefore the situation was getting a little difficult in the early medieval period or in the post-Gupta period. Finally, we should talk about little bit of the goodness of the state, which was prescribed by the Shastric literature, that is tax exemption. And in some cases the taxes were exempted. For example, state allowed remission of taxes for 5 years if irrigation works such as tanks and lakes were newly dug by enterprising people. Then we have the Buddhist literature, who also informs us that if crop failed, the peasant were actually getting remission or at least postponement of his dues. We have references in the for example, women of all castes in Apastambha, students living with the teachers, Shudras, the blind, the dumb, the deaf and the diseased, etc. were to be immune from taxation. And the same opinion is of other lawgivers too. So therefore, some articles were also given benefits of taxation, like those from the presentation. If you are presenting something to the king, then it will not be taxed. If you are presenting something for sacrificial and ceremonial purposes, it will not be taxed. High quality seeds, productive seeds, which are also difficult to obtain, were also allowed remission. So there was conditions where the state actually looked after people who needed immunity from taxation. Now when we look at the whole picture holistically, we can say that several fiscal terms indicating taxes on land was introduced in the Arthashastra, though we have reference to some in the early period and also down to the Gupta period. The precise meaning changed with the change of context, and for example we have the case of Bali, which I explained to you. Then taxes such as bhaga, kara, hiranya continued in the Sritis and also in the later land grants. So there is a continuation. When there is a change, there is also a continuation. In the case studies of the Mauryas, the Mauryan effects at controlling economy and for the betterment of the revenues yielded from agriculture, crafts and others could be seen. This was used for maintenance of the large army and therefore the sizable number of functionaries that the Mauryas had. We already mentioned that revenues were both paid in cash and kind. In the Gupta period, many new tax names had come up, and these new tax names were generally related to land. Contributions in cash and kind were levied side by side. So therefore, the principle of taxation laid down in our literature were followed by the rulers, and we know that in ancient India, looking at the texts particularly and the inscriptions, we have a balanced mode of taxation which shows that taxes were levied both in cash and also in kind. Thank you.